Welcome to true Wild West love stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The winter winds of the Arizona Territory rolled like white ghosts across the high desert plains, swallowing the land in a brutal silence that only the Wild West could bear. Snow rarely touched this stretch of the frontier, but when it came like a curse, an unexpected, sharp reminder that nature ruled everything west of the Mississippi. On such a night, when even coyotes hid from the cold and ranch lanterns flickered low against the frost, a lone figure staggered across the barren stretch between the foothills and the distant cattle trails. She moved as if the wind pushed her forward rather than her own strength. Wrapped in furs stiff with ice, her breaths came out in broken clouds before the storm swallowed them whole. Her name was Noya, a young Apache woman whose footsteps had once carried the rhythm of her people's ancient trails. But on this night she was a shadow half, conscious, freezing, and driven by a determination too raw to name. Behind her, the mountains loomed like silent witnesses. Ahead of her, miles of unknown terrain stretched endlessly. The cold crept deeper into her bones with every step, threatening to still her heartbeat entirely. She tried to recall how long she had been walking, hours or days, but her memories tangled with fevered flashes of smoke, gunfire, and shouting. She had escaped something brutal, something that had shattered the quiet harmony of her life. Now, as her vision blurred into a silver haze, everything narrowed to the simple need to keep moving. But her body could not obey forever. The storm grew stronger, lashing at her exposed skin, numbing her hands and weakening her hold on the fur cloak around her shoulders. She stumbled against a fallen fence post, left abandoned on an old cattle property. Her legs trembled, refusing to lift again. The ice beneath her boots cracked, and she sank to her knees. The world swayed violently like a river in flood. Noya felt the warmth draining from her limbs, sinking deeper toward a chilling stillness that felt too much like surrender. She lowered herself to the ground, her cheek pressing into the frost. Her eyelashes froze shut, and her breaths became faint wisps. The storm roared around her, yet she heard nothing anymore, only the slow, steady whisper of unconsciousness wrapping around her like a final blanket. Hours later, when the storm eased and the first flicker of dawn pressed against the horizon, a lone cowboy rode across the blanketed plain. The man was known to locals simply as Cade, though few claimed to know much about him. He was a quiet presence in the frontier towns, one who avoided barroom quarrels and drifted like a ghost between ranches, offering help where needed but never staying long. Cade's horse trudged through the snow, its breath steaming in the faint morning light. Cade had been checking his fence lines and searching for stray cattle pushed out of shelter by the storm. His keen eyes scanned the landscape out of habit, but even he did not expect to find a motionless form half buried near the broken fencing. At first, he thought it was debris, a cloak caught on a drift, or a fallen cowhide. But as he urged his horse closer, the shape took form, a woman, small, frozen, and barely alive. Cade dismounted slowly, approaching with caution. The frontier had taught him that appearances could be deceiving. Yet as he knelt beside her and brushed the snow from her face, he felt an unexpected jolt. Her skin was chilled, but not lifeless. Her breathing was weak but present. Her features clearly marked her as Apache, though her attire was torn, burned in places, and soaked from the storm. He recognized the urgency immediately. If he hesitated, she would die. There was no town within miles, and no doctor close enough to reach in time. His cabin, isolated as it was, offered the only hope of survival. Cade acted without hesitation. He lifted her gently, wrapping her in his heavy coat, and secured her on his horse as carefully as a man would carry fractured glass. The journey back to his cabin was slow but steady, every step of the horse pressing through the rising snow. Cade's cabin lay sheltered in a small hollow beneath rocky bluffs, warmed by a wood stove he kept burning through the bitter season. When he reached it, he carried the woman inside, kicked the door shut behind him, and laid her near the stove's warmth. She did not stir. Her pulse fluttered weakly against his fingertips. Her clothing, still icy, clung to her skin. Cade moved with quiet urgency, stripping away the frozen layers and covering her with soft buffalo hides. He heated water, warmed stones, and placed them carefully around her. For hours he stayed near, keeping the fire alive and monitoring the slow return of warmth to her cheeks. The storm raged outside again, hammering the small cabin walls, but inside, a fragile battle for life continued. As night returned, her breath steadied, her fingers twitched slightly beneath the hides. Cade felt a subtle wave of relief, one he hadn't anticipated. Saving strangers wasn't something he planned for, yet something about this woman stirred a sense of responsibility he couldn't explain. He sat in his wooden chair, arms crossed, watching over her. Her face in the firelight carried both strength and exhaustion. Whoever she was, whatever had led her into the storm, it was clear she had endured something far beyond a winter night. The shadows shifted as the fire crackled softly. Cade's cabin, normally silent and solitary, now felt surprisingly alive with the presence of this unknown woman. He wondered whether she would wake in fear, confusion, or anger. He wondered what story she carried, buried beneath frostbite and exhaustion. But for now, she remained motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Cade leaned back, letting the long day settle heavy on his shoulders. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, but inside, the warmth grew stronger. The storm would pass, and when it did, everything about his quiet, solitary life would begin to change, though he did not yet know it. For in a land shaped by survival, fate often arrived in unexpected forms, and sometimes it arrived frozen and half, dead on a winter morning. As the firelight flickered across the room, Noya's eyelids trembled ever so slightly, hinting at the moment soon to come, the moment she would awaken in a quiet cowboy's bed, unaware of how deeply her path was about to intertwine with his. The storm outside had given way to a pale morning, a thin glow of winter sunlight stretching slowly across the rugged horizon. Inside the cabin, warmth pressed gently against the cold that clung stubbornly to the corners of the room. Cade had kept the fire alive through the night, feeding it until the orange embers glowed like molten stone, steady and protective. Noya lay beneath the heavy buffalo hides, her breaths gradually shifting from shallow, fragile wisps to deeper, steadier motions. Her body, once stiffened by frost, had begun to loosen, allowing life to seep back into her frozen limbs. Hours passed in quiet stillness as the cabin embraced the warmth of the new day. When the sun finally crested the ridge, its first rays slipped through the single cabin window, brushing across her face. The sudden change in light triggered an instinctual response, and her eyelids fluttered weakly. The transition from unconsciousness to awareness was slow and disorienting, as if her mind was wading through a thick fog. At first, she felt only warmth, a deep, enveloping warmth that contrasted so sharply with the cold she remembered last that it felt unreal. Then came the soft weight of the hides, the scent of burning cedar wood, and the faint crackling of the fire. These sensations drifted around her like unfamiliar spirits, urging her to rise from the void she had been trapped in. Her hand twitched beneath the covers, her brow furrowed faintly. Memories clashed with the present moment, forming blurred images of the storm, the hopeless numbness, and the moment she collapsed. But none of it aligned with where she found herself now. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The world came into focus in fragments: the rough wooden beams above her, the shifting glow of firelight, the sturdy furniture arranged neatly around the room. She recognized none of it. It was neither the wilderness nor her people's camp, nor the hostile ground she had fled. Her heart beat faster, though her body remained too weak to move more than a fraction. She attempted to lift herself, but a wave of exhaustion swept through her limbs, pinning her gently back into the bed. Her breathing grew quicker as her senses sharpened, alert to every detail around her. It was then she noticed him, the lone cowboy, seated quietly near the stove. Cade sat motionless, elbows rested on his knees, his gaze steady but distant, as if he had been keeping watch for many hours. His presence seemed carved from the same stillness that filled the cabin, calm and controlled. He did not move when she stirred. He remained steady, allowing her to awaken without disturbance. Noya studied him cautiously, though she could barely keep her eyes open. Her instincts, honed through years of survival, urged her to understand her surroundings as swiftly as possible. She saw no weapons drawn, no sign of threat, only a rugged man in worn clothes, sitting in a posture that suggested vigilance rather than hostility. The hides around her smelled faintly of animal musk and smoke. Beneath them, her torn garments had been removed, replaced by dry linens, warm and soft against her skin. For a moment, panic pricked at her chest, not fear of the man, but the sudden realization of her own vulnerability. She had survived the storm only to awaken in the home of a stranger. Yet, as the fire crackled steadily, another realization rose. She was alive because of him. Without his intervention, the winter night would have claimed her completely. She attempted to move again, her hand inching toward the edge of the bed. The motion was small, but enough to catch Cade's attention. His head turned slightly, acknowledging her awakening. Noya's vision blurred again as exhaustion overwhelmed her brief surge of awareness. She sank back into the hides, her breaths shallow but steady. The warmth of the room pressed gently against her fading consciousness. She wanted to rise, to understand, to defend herself if needed, but her strength had not yet returned. The cabin walls faded back into a soft blur, and she drifted once more, not into the dangerous darkness of near frost, death, but into the safer, slower pull of recovery. Hours passed as she slept again, though this time her breathing was strong and rhythmic. Cade kept to his quiet tasks, tending the fire, checking the warm stones, and preparing a pot of broth for when she woke properly. His movements were deliberate, the habits of a man used to long stretches of silence and responsibility. Outside, the storm's remnants swept across the valley, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in white. The world seemed paused, holding its breath as if aware of the fragile thread that now connected the cowboy and the woman he had rescued. By midday, Noya awoke once more, this time with more clarity. The warmth in her body had spread fully, easing the stiffness that once threatened to claim her life. She blinked up at the ceiling, her breathing deep and steady. The sense of cooked broth and cedar smoke greeted her, grounding her further into the reality of the cabin. Her thoughts returned, clearer than before. She remembered the danger she had fled, the attack on her camp, the terrifying eruption of violence that forced her to run into the mountains with nothing but instinct guiding her. She had lost track of time and direction as the storm consumed her path. Her limbs had grown numb, her vision dim, and she had walked until even survival instinct faded. And now she was here, alive but lost in a stranger's home. The weight of the hides comforted her, but did not erase the pressing question of what awaited her once she regained her strength. Her people were somewhere out there scattered, hiding, maybe wounded or worse. She did not know whether she would find them again or whether the path back remained safe. But for now, she could not move far. She needed strength, she needed clarity, she needed time. The fire glowed brighter as Cade added more wood. His quiet presence filled the space without imposing on it, creating an unusual sense of safety despite the uncertainty. The sun continued its slow climb, sending pale gold through the frosted windowpane. Noya drew a deeper breath and let it out slowly, grounding herself in the new reality she had awakened into. The storm had brought her to the brink of death, but fate had carried her into the hands of someone who had chosen to save her rather than leave her to the snow. It was a beginning neither of them had sought, yet somehow it felt as if the path ahead had already started shifting towards something neither could yet foresee. As the fire crackled and the day stretched on, Noya's eyes closed once more, not from weakness, but from the peaceful exhaustion of someone finally safe enough to rest. But outside, the world of the Wild West was stirring again, and the dangers she had fled were not as distant as the quiet cabin made them seem. A new chapter of her journey was beginning, shaped now by the presence of the quiet cowboy who had pulled her back from the brink. The sun rose slowly over the white-washed plains, casting long shadows across the frozen earth. By the time its pale glow filtered into the cabin, the fire had already been tended, the stove warmed, and the quiet rhythm of survival had resumed inside the small wooden shelter. Cade moved with practiced ease, stepping softly so as not to disturb the recovering woman who lay beneath the heavy buffalo hides. Noya's breath was steadier now, no longer the fragile whisper it had been when he carried her into the cabin. Her cheeks had regained a faint color, and the stiffness that once threatened her life had receded under days of slow, patient warmth. Though she slept deeply, the tension in her body revealed the turmoil beneath her stillness, a quiet reminder of the dangers she had escaped and the uncertainty waiting beyond the cabin walls. When she finally stirred, the movement rippled like a soft tremor through the hides. Her fingers flexed, her brow tightened, and she shifted slightly, letting her senses slowly reconnect with the world around her. The fire's warmth pressed gently into her skin. The scent of simmering broth drifted from the stove. The faint creak of floorboards and the soft hum of winter wind against the cabin windows shaped her awareness. With a slow inhale, she let the present moment settle inside her. The memory of the storm returned first, its blinding white, its brutal cold, its merciless grip. Then came the echoes of gunfire and chaos from the night that drove her into the mountains. She saw, in flashes, the scattered remnants of her people's camp, the embers of burning hides, the shapes of riders forcing her tribe into desperate flight. The images twisted like smoke through her mind, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still feared. Her eyes opened with more clarity than before. She found herself once again in the bed that had saved her life, wrapped in unfamiliar warmth, her weakened body sinking slightly into the dry linens beneath her. She felt the weight of vulnerability, an Apache woman alone in a white man's cabin, miles from the safety of her people. Yet she also felt a strange sense of security, carved from the steadiness of the space around her. Cade stood a short distance away, his posture relaxed as he poured warm broth into a wooden bowl. His presence, though quiet, filled the room with a grounded calm. There was no sign of aggression or tension, only a sense of responsibility that seemed woven into his very manner. Noya tried to lift herself, her muscles trembling with the effort. Weeks of exhaustion, cold, and fear weighed on her limbs, but she pushed through the weakness long enough to settle into a sitting position. Every part of her felt heavy, as if her spirit carried the burden of her entire tribe's fate. She wrapped the hides closer around herself, more for modesty than warmth, and observed her surroundings with sharpened awareness. Her world had changed drastically. One moment she was a daughter of the foothills, guided by tradition and surrounded by the familiar presence of her people. The next she was alone in a stranger's shelter, saved by chance and circumstance. She could not yet decide whether this turn of fate was blessing or danger. Cade quietly placed the bowl near her, giving her space to regain strength. Though he made no sound to interrupt her rest, she sensed his watchfulness, steady, patient, and respectful. It was an unusual kindness in a frontier where trust was a rare and fragile commodity. She knew well that most encounters between settlers and her people were marked by fear, suspicion, or violence. Yet here she was, sheltered by a man who had chosen compassion over distance or conflict. Her hands trembled as she slowly gained equilibrium. She knew she owed her survival to this cabin and to the quiet cowboy who lived within it. But with survival came a renewed sense of purpose. Her people were still out there, scattered, hiding, perhaps hunted. She could not remain here forever, even if her body demanded rest. As the hours passed, heat seeped deeper into her bones, loosening the last remnants of frost that clung to her spirit. She ate in small, careful motions, her strength returning in slow increments. Each sip of broth brought clarity, each breath brought resolve. The cabin itself was simple and functional, a single room with neatly arranged supplies, sturdy wooden beams, and a stone hearth that seemed to pulse with life. Animal pelts hung beside the door, tools rested in precise order, and every corner spoke of a man who lived alone, yet lived with intention. There was no chaos, no waste, and no sign of a second occupant besides herself. Outside, the winter world remained quiet and unforgiving. Snow draped the land like a heavy blanket, concealing both danger and salvation beneath its surface. Tracks from the night before had vanished entirely beneath the new layer, erasing any trace of the path she had taken. Days passed in this fragile balance, a balance shaped by the cabin's warmth and the tension in her heart. Noya regained strength at a steady pace, though not without moments of pain and fatigue. Cade continued his quiet routines, tending the land around the cabin, chopping firewood, and ensuring she had what she needed to recover. Though no words passed between them, a silent understanding grew. Two lives, shaped by different worlds, had collided by the hand of fate, now bound together by necessity and circumstance. But with every sunrise, Noya felt a deeper pull toward the outside world, a growing urgency that reminded her of her people, her past, and the dangers that had not yet faded. She knew the attackers who scattered her tribe would not stop until their intentions were fulfilled. Whether they sought land, revenge, or domination, she did not yet know, but she felt their threat lingering like a shadow over the horizon. One evening, as the dim light of dusk filtered into the cabin, she found herself gathering the courage to rise fully from the bed. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she stood with the quiet strength of someone who refused to remain helpless any longer. She walked slowly to the window, gripping the wooden frame for balance, and gazed out at the vast, frozen land that stretched endlessly before her. The world outside was both beautiful and dangerous, an expanse of quiet where violence could hide behind the next hill. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her people were either waiting or running. Her heart tightened with the heavy ache of uncertainty. She could remain here and survive, but survival meant nothing if she abandoned those she belonged to. Behind her, the fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth. But beyond the window, the world waited with cold, relentless truth. And in the growing stillness of dusk, Noya knew her time to remain sheltered was slowly coming to an end. She would have to decide whether to stay in this unexpected refuge, or to step back into the wilderness that had nearly claimed her life. The moment of choice crept closer with every beat of her heart, setting the stage for a new storm, not of snow, but of fate. The morning broke with a brittle stillness, the kind that settles over the frontier when the storms finally exhaust themselves. Frost clung to every branch, every fence post, every inch of ground beyond the cabin walls. The world appeared carved from glass, quiet, unmoving, waiting. Inside the cabin, warmth still drifted gently from the hearth, but the air held an underlying tension, the kind born from unspoken truths and approaching decisions. Noya stood near the small window, wrapped tightly in the buffalo hide Cade had given her. She had regained enough strength to walk without trembling, and though pain still pulled faintly at her muscles, her spirit felt sharper, steadier. She could no longer deny the restlessness growing inside her. Her people might be suffering, scattered, or in hiding. She could not remain here indefinitely while uncertainty pulled at her like a tightening rope. She watched the land outside, scanning the horizon as if searching for ghosts. The valley lay quiet, a white stretch of untouched snow that seemed deceptively peaceful. Yet she felt an unease beneath the landscape, an instinct honed by years of living close to the earth. The wilderness rarely stayed silent for long, and its quiet moments often carried warnings. Cade moved through his morning tasks with the same calm focus he always carried. He checked his supplies, kept the fire alive, and set out his tools in quiet preparation for whatever work the day demanded. Yet he, too, seemed aware of a shift in the air. His movements held a subtle alertness now, a readiness shaped by years of fending off dangers, both natural and human. As Noya strengthened, the balance of the cabin began to change. What had been a place of recovery was becoming a crossroads. The unspoken truth lingered between them. She did not belong here permanently, and he did not expect her to. But the dangers beyond the cabin walls were real, and neither of them knew what awaited her once she stepped back into the wilderness. When Noya stepped outside for the first time since the storm, the cold wrapped around her like a stark reminder of the world she had narrowly escaped. Her breath drifted into the frozen air, and she surveyed the land around the cabin with sharpened clarity. The silence was immense, the snow deep, and the tracks from days before long since erased. She walked slowly, testing her strength, feeling the crunch of snow under her feet. The cold bit at her skin, but it no longer threatened her life. She had survived the worst of it, but now she faced a different kind of challenge, one shaped by memory, fear, and responsibility. As she looked across the valley, a faint disturbance caught her eye. Snow, disturbed in places where it should have been smooth. Subtle impressions that only someone trained in reading land could recognize. Footprints, not from Cade, and not from animals. They were faint, partially filled by drifting snow, but they followed a direction that led toward the foothills where she had collapsed days earlier. She knelt, brushing away a thin layer of snow. The prints were intentional, a small group, moving in a formation that suggested hunters or scouts. Not the tracks of her people who traveled lightly and left little trace. These were heavier, more deliberate, made by boots rather than moccasins. A chill not born of winter traveled through her. She knew these signs. These were the same kind of tracks she had seen before the attack on her tribe. Riders who moved with purpose, who carried fire and violence wherever they went. She felt her pulse quicken, not from fear alone, but from the realization that danger was closer than she thought. The storm had hidden them, but the world had cleared, and now their presence pressed against the edges of safety like a storm preparing to rise again. She rose slowly, her breath deeper, her mind bracing for the truth she had hoped to delay. The attackers who had scattered her people were still tracking the land, and now their path had crossed dangerously close to the only refuge she had found. Inside the cabin, the warmth felt different when she stepped back in. No longer a shelter, but a fragile barrier between safety and threat. Her instincts tightened. She knew she could not remain here if these men scouted the valley. Their kind rarely left witnesses untouched, and they would not hesitate to bring destruction to anyone who protected her. The realization settled heavily over her. Cade's quiet life was at risk, simply because he had chosen to save her. Her presence, once a burden of survival, had become a danger to them both. Outside, the crunch of snow beneath distant boots seemed to echo in her mind. Even though the land remained physically silent, she could almost feel the approaching tension, the looming shadow of the past returning to claim what it had failed to finish. The hours that followed carried a sharp undercurrent. Noya moved with purpose, now gathering the strength she had regained, preparing herself mentally for the moment she would need to leave. She repacked her few belongings, testing her endurance, steadying her breathing against the ache in her muscles. She knew the journey would be difficult, but staying could doom them both. As dusk approached, Cade stepped outside to check the land, unaware of the prints she had already discovered. He paused at the ridge, scanning the horizon with a hunter's awareness, unaware that dangerous eyes may have already swept across the same valley earlier that day. The sky darkened into shades of violet and steel, the cold deepening once more. Noya stood at the window, watching the cowboy return from his quiet survey of the land. His posture was calm, his movements steady, but she sensed that he, too, felt something shifting beyond the ordinary rhythm of frontier life. Night settled quickly, draping the cabin in a protective darkness. The fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows across the room. But Noya could not sleep. She sat near the window, listening to the distant wind and the quiet creaking of winter. Every sound felt sharper, carrying hints of danger. Her path was calling again, harsh, uncertain, but necessary. She knew the moment was coming when she would have to choose between staying safe in the warmth of the cabin or stepping back into the harsh world that awaited her. The past was closing in, and the cabin could no longer shield her from the storm rising beyond its walls. The night deepened, and Noya tightened her resolve, feeling the beginnings of a new journey stirring inside her. The morning rose pale and heavy, as though the winter sky itself sensed the weight of what was coming. The desert stretched ahead in long folds of muted color, still draped in a lingering layer of frost. Every ridge, every shadow, every quiet breath of wind seemed sharpened by the tension building around the quiet cowboy and the Apache woman he had sworn to protect. Their path wound deeper into a canyon where the sun rarely reached this time of year, leaving the earth hardened, brittle, and cold beneath their boots and hooves. The woman felt the shift before they saw anything. A lifetime of surviving in unforgiving landscapes had taught her to trust the smallest changes, the unnatural silence of birds, the too still air, the way her horse twitched its ears toward distant slopes. Something had been set in motion long before dawn, something hunting them, closing around them with patience rather than haste. Danger moved like a second shadow across the canyon floor. Elias Boone, hardened by years of lonely riding and quiet observation, felt it too. His hand rested on his rifle, not in panic, but in readiness. He had never been a man who recklessly sought trouble, yet trouble had found him all the same, entangled in the fate of the woman he had rescued from the snow. Together they pressed forward, though the canyon narrowed, its steep walls rising like jagged sentinels of old battles and forgotten graves. The trail dipped into a shallow bend where the wind carried an icy taste of distant snowfall. The woman scanned the high ridges with an instinct shaped by generations of survival. She recognized the kind of silence that hid predators. The outlaws who hunted her had tracked her tribe for weeks before she fled. They knew this land well enough to stage an ambush in a place where escape would be nearly impossible. Every step deeper into the canyon confirmed their intention. Not long after noon, the echo of shifting gravel whispered across the ridge. A small sound, easy to dismiss, almost harmless. But in the Wild West, such sounds were never simple. The woman stiffened. Elias halted the horses. Then the canyon exploded into chaos. Gunfire cracked through the cold air, bouncing off stone walls in violent echoes. Dust burst upward from the canyon floor, kicked by bullets fired from high vantage points. The ambush had sprung with ruthless precision. Riders appeared on both sides of the canyon rim, their silhouettes sharp against the sky, their faces hidden beneath wide hats and scarves. These were the same men who had chased the woman through snowstorms, who had left destruction in their path, who would stop at nothing to claim the bounty placed on her head by men who knew nothing of her people or her honor. Elias urged the horses behind a cluster of boulders, knowing that a wrong move could mean the end for both of them. He moved with a steady determination, not driven by fury, but by a quiet resolve carved into his bones. Every calculated shift of his weight, every measured glance at the ridges, reflected a lifetime of battles fought without fanfare or recognition. The woman followed with swift agility, despite the wounds that still marked her body. Survival had always been her first language, and she responded to danger with the clarity of instinct rather than fear. The outlaws descended the canyon slopes with the confidence of men certain of their victory. But the West was unpredictable. The land, the wind, and the spirits of those who had walked it long before them had their own way of tipping the balance. The Apache woman positioned herself at an angle where she could observe the attackers' movements, her breath steady despite the rising dust and the sting of cold air in her lungs. The battle unfolded in bursts of gunfire and rushing footsteps. Elias fought with the quiet precision that defined him, never wasting a shot, never losing his composure even as bullets shattered the rocks around him. The woman moved like a shifting shadow, slipping between boulders, using the terrain to her advantage. Together, silently and without hesitation, they formed an unspoken rhythm of survival, one defending, one advancing, each move complementing the other. Dust clouds thickened around the canyon as horses whinnied, and outlaws shouted commands to one another. But the canyon walls swallowed most of the noise, trapping it like a storm in a sealed box. The world narrowed to fragments of motion, bursts of muzzle flashes, and the raw instinct to endure. One outlaw attempted to circle behind them, but the woman intercepted his movement with swift anticipation. Her presence carried the force of someone who had been shaped by harsh winters and relentless hardship. Her actions were quiet but decisive, a testament to the strength hidden beneath scars and exhaustion. Elias supported her advance without ever needing to speak. Their paths, though different in origin, had aligned with uncanny precision. The tide of the battle began to turn, as exhaustion and miscalculation chipped away at the outlaws' confidence. The canyon had become their trap instead of their ambush site. The rugged slopes they believed would shield them now exposed their positions. Elias and the woman, though outnumbered, had the will of two souls who refused to surrender. They pressed forward step by step, carving a path through danger with determination alone. When the final shots echoed out, the canyon fell abruptly silent. Dust hung in the air like drifting ghosts. The last of the outlaws fell still on the rocks, leaving the canyon floor littered with the aftermath of desperation and greed. The wind returned slowly, whistling through narrow gaps in the cliffs, carrying away the remnants of violence. Elias breathed out a long, steady exhale. Though fatigue weighed heavily on him, his focus remained sharp, ensuring no hidden threat lingered. The woman stood beside him, shoulders rising and falling with controlled breaths. The battle had drained what little strength she had regained since escaping the icy storm, yet she remained unbroken. But the victory was not a true ending. The burden of what had happened settled heavily upon them both. The outlaws who had fallen were only one danger among many in the vast and restless West. The world had grown perilous for anyone tied to the harsh line between settlers and native lands. And though the woman had survived the ambush, she knew this was only one chapter in a much larger struggle. As the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Elias helped her mount her horse once more. Their shadows stretched long across the cold stone floor as they began the slow ride back toward safer ground. Neither spoke, yet the weight of unspoken truths followed them like a lingering storm. The canyon faded behind them, its silence returning, its secrets buried once more in frozen earth. Ahead lay uncertainty, choices, and the approaching crossroads of fate. And so, as night settled across the frontier, a final question hung between them, one that would shape everything that came next. The silence of the canyon settled like dust after a long storm. The air smelled of gunpowder and cold stone, and the echoes of the battle faded slowly into the open sky. Elias Boone stood with a weariness that ran deeper than fatigue, deeper even than the wounds hidden beneath his coat. His breath trembled in the chilled evening air as he looked across the ravine where the last of the outlaw riders had fallen. The danger that had followed the Apache woman for so long had finally ended in this unforgiving stretch of desert. Yet the world around him refused to celebrate. The winter light dimmed as the sun dipped behind the ridges, turning the sky to an amber red that poured itself across the land like a final warning that nothing in the west stayed peaceful for long. Elias, steady and reserved as ever, lowered his rifle and stood very still, listening for anything that might suggest more danger. Heartbeats passed, slow and heavy. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The desert had taken its due and returned to silence. On the far side of the clearing, the Apache woman watched the quiet cowboy with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The burdens she carried had been heavy long before the storm that nearly froze her life away. Even now, with the threat gone, the shadows of her past lingered around her, looping through memory and fear like spirits of old battles. She stood strong, though fatigue pulled at her bones, and she knew the moment had come when she could no longer pretend she was simply recovering. Their paths had been tied by the cold wind of chance, but what lay ahead would require choices neither could delay. The quiet cowboy moved toward her with the steadiness that had always defined him. He had risked his life again and again to protect a woman who had once been a stranger. Yet now she felt his presence like a tether to the world she had nearly lost. But this was the Wild West, unpredictable, vast, and always demanding change. Nothing stayed soft for long. Nothing stayed safe. The woman knew she could not remain hidden in his small cabin forever. The world outside with its broken treaties and wandering hostilities, would not simply forget she existed. The outlaw gang that hunted her might have been ended today, but the violence of the frontier rarely centered around just one threat. Her own people still needed her, and the land that shaped her life continued calling to her like a distant drumbeat. As the sky deepened into purple dusk, Elias guided her back toward the trail, careful with his steps, attentive to her weakened pace. Though she no longer staggered, the exhaustion of everything they had endured weighed heavily on her. The canyon walls rose around them like ancient guardians, their surfaces etched by centuries of wind and stories. The path home was long, and the world seemed to understand the gravity of their silence. When they reached the horses, they paused. The stillness between them carried everything words could not, every risk they had taken, every moment of trust built without a single spoken promise. She knew he belonged to the earth in a way settlers rarely did. He moved with the modest precision of someone who sought neither trouble nor glory, only survival. And yet he had stepped into danger for her without hesitation, guided not by obligation, but something deeper, something rare. Their journey back to the cabin took hours. The temperature dropped steadily, and frost began to gather on the edges of the saddle and reins. The land glowed under moonlight, silvering the desert floor, softening the harshness of the cliffs, wrapping everything in a fragile beauty that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the battle. At last, the familiar outline of the cabin appeared through the trees, small and solitary, yet radiating a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire inside. Inside, the flames flickered anew, casting golden light across the wooden walls. The woman moved with a slow, deliberate grace, lowering herself onto the edge of the bed where her ordeal had first begun, frozen, half conscious, breathing through the unbearable cold of a winter meant to kill her. Now she sat upright, alive, with strength returning to her limbs. The memory of that moment, when she had first opened her eyes to find herself in a stranger's home, felt distant, like a story belonging to another lifetime. But something in the air made it clear that this cabin, once a place of isolation and quiet labor, had changed forever. It had become a place where fate had intervened, where danger had brought two unlikely souls together, where trust had been shaped by survival rather than words. And it was here, in this narrow slice of wilderness, that she understood the truth she had been avoiding. Her path was diverging from his. The Apache people had always lived by the rhythms of the land, and she was no exception. Her people needed her strength, her knowledge, her unwavering spirit. She could not abandon them, not even for the flicker of warmth she felt in this cabin or the steady presence of the cowboy who had sheltered her. The West was shifting, tribes being pushed to the edges of their ancestral lands, and she knew that her role within her community was larger than her own desires. Elias accepted this quietly, as he accepted everything. His eyes held no bitterness, no heartbreak, only a deep acknowledgment of the truth. He had never been a man who tried to hold onto what the world did not grant him. He understood the weight of destiny, the pull of loyalty, and the harsh beauty of letting something go with dignity. The morning that followed came slow and cold. The woman prepared to leave before dawn fully broke. She moved with calm resolve, tying her belongings, fastening her cloak, and stepping into the early frost that gleamed across the ground. The quiet cowboy accompanied her a short distance toward the ridge, riding beside her through the stillness of the early light. At the ridge's peak, where the land opened toward the distant Apache territories, they stopped. There, under a pale sky streaked with early gold, she looked at him one last time. No words passed between them, no promises were made. The West did not thrive on promises. It thrived on survival, on moments carved from hardship, on bonds formed in the spaces where life and death brushed too closely. The connection they had built was one of those rare bonds, shaped not by declarations but by action, sacrifice, and quiet understanding. She turned her horse toward the distant cliffs. He watched until she became a silhouette, then a speck, then a memory carried on the wind. As the sun rose over the cold desert, casting long shadows across the land, Elias Boone rode back toward his solitary cabin. The West had taken from him and given to him in equal measure. He knew life would settle again into its old routines, but he would never forget the winter when fate had placed a frozen Apache woman at his doorstep, nor the silent story they had lived together. The world would continue, seasons would shift, battles would come and go, but somewhere deep within the heart of the Wild West, two paths, though now separated, would remain forever linked by the storm that brought them together.